All right, for today's SONAR update, Wednesday, August 12th, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the market as a whole and some indicators coming from some of the different SONAR indices. So, tender rejections are remaining relatively flat. We're at 13.5%, which is back in line with what we were seeing in April earlier this year. However, demand has stopped falling. STVI, SONAR, truckload volume index. When you look at the seasonality chart, it shows that we are still above the prior 3 years for demand. And when you zoom into just the last 3 months, we are seeing a minor uptick, especially since August 8th. So that's an indicator that demand is beginning to rise. So I wanted to take that a step further when thinking about demand and volumes and look at loaded inbound containers. So our IOTI index, when you look at it this year versus last year, you can see that since June, we're seeing an uptick in imports of loaded containers. We're not seeing the numbers degrade compared to earlier in the year like we were seeing. We're really seeing a broader peak this year, pun intended, both the peak here in the mountain chart, but also when it refers to peak season. So the uptick compared to last year is much longer and more and broader. It's more elongated. Again, especially when you compare it to last year, where there was that sharp and shorter peak of imports around some of the tariff noise that was happening. So we're seeing more inventory and more containers come in at a higher number, but really over a longer period of time and a little bit more continued out versus all at once. So my question from this is, has enough inventory been ordered to sustain us through later in this season? Because when you look at the LMI inventory levels and compare them year over year to last year, we're down 9%. So that's certainly something I'll be continuing to watch. So then when I was looking at loaded container numbers, I wanted to dig into O-Rail and compare domestic loaded containers and intermodal volumes to international loaded containers. And it really further proved the point that we have been talking about this week regarding this mode conversion story, and that there's not necessarily less volume that we're seeing as tender rejections have fallen a bit, but that a lot of that volume is shifting to domestic rail. So the chart shows when you look at the last 2 years, that intermodal loaded containers internationally are down 13% in the last 2 years, while loaded domestic containers are up 7%. So if you zoom into that and look at just the last 6 months, still the same story. Loaded domestic containers are up 5%, with loaded international containers down 2%. So really, again, this is a story of mode conversion and intermodal rail having a moment domestically and really having the opportunity to continue to pick up market share and additional volume. So then I wanted to think about, rather than just demand, also capacity, as we're still hearing that capacity is certainly tight. We're still seeing those tender rejections around 13.5%, but we've seen a cooling in that in the last few weeks. So we just released updated CNDCA numbers, carrier details, net changes, and trucking authorities. And to me, those numbers were a bit surprising. The data shows that while there is a weekly net decline in trucking operating authorities through Q1 2026, beginning in Q2, there's been a relatively sustained uptick in more entrants getting operating authority than those operating authorities being revoked. Q3 to date, we saw a net gain of 1,996 operating authorities from the week ending July 3rd through the week ending August 7th. That number is 914 behind Q2's total gain of 2,910 operating authorities, but 1,596 ahead of a gain of 400 authorities in Q1. So we are seeing additional authorities come in as we enter the year and at a faster pace in Q2, slowing a bit so far in Q3, but we'll see. I think some of that Q2 peak could have been from some of the noise around the new tools and carriers actually getting registered and their operating authority numbers and all of those things. But to kind of put it in perspective, a total of 19,594 net revocations have occurred year to date, but enough capacity has entered to offset that net loss, resulting in a net gain of over 5,000 unique operating authorities. So my question there is, I don't think it's a massive amount of capacity entering the system. I think it's small carriers, entering, taking advantage of the healthier freight market with higher rates. But are these new entrants sustainable? And to me, I am struggling wrapping my head around how they could be. Are brokers still tendering freight to carriers with new MC numbers and no safety rating based on current fraud conditions, as well as certainly litigation and liability concerns? So while we are seeing an increase in some of these net authorities, I don't know that it's necessarily translating to more capacity being available. We'll continue to watch that through the rest of the year, as I do believe that demand will continue to rise and pick up a bit. And that there's not going to be a massive entrance of new capacity, even with some of these new operating authorities entering the market. I think they're going to have a very hard time getting freight. Certainly, shippers are going to be pickier about who they're tendering freight to. And if I were a broker, I would be incredibly picky about who I am tendering freight to right now and ensuring that I have covered all of my bases. So we will be watching through the end of the year as we expect demand to continue to rise as we get closer to peak, and we will see what happens with break check at the end of August, and what that does to capacity, and if it's a very short term rise in tender rejections and decline in available capacity, or if that is sort of the beginning of kicking off another really hot cycle.
Okay, so one point that I do want to make a little bit more clear regarding the net carrier authorities, and if you can pull up just the 1 year graphic again, if you guys have it, you could see that there's a big peak there towards the back half, the green part in June. And I want to be clear that I think some of that was backlog, right? With the
Because
modus
of Modus, the Modus
transition,
challenges.
we got no data from May 16th until June 5th.
You couldn't even
because there
register.
was no
Registrations were a problem.
So I think some of that peak that's this year, which is
The
the part you
surge.
can see in green, that surge on the right-hand side is primarily around that and catching up from that time when it was down.
It does maintain growth, but it's important to know that if you go back pre-COVID, when the industry was adding 250 fleets a week, like this is not unusual to see growth. That does happen. So
yeah, that graphic is perfect, guys. That exactly what Craig was talking about. When you go back further, when you look at 5 years, there was massive growth.
Well, that was COVID, but you go even, we've had contraction. I think we're in a stable market.
Yeah.
I would call this a stable market. The fact that the market is responding to normal seasonal calendar inputs is just telling us that the market is stable. I don't see the case for continued increase in capacity because you're not able to find drivers to fill the seats. That even if fleets wanted to expand, we've heard this consistently, is that they're having to pay more for drivers. The driver environment is getting harder and harder. And that is going to keep the cap on capacity.
Yep, I agree.
So
I don't know where the driver market would come from, right? I mean,
where are they going to come
do
from?
it?
I mean, immigration has been the big relief valve. The BLS data says as many as 20% of drivers are non-US born immigrants. Insurance companies, and that was, I think in 2019 was that data. Insurance companies have told us that the number they believe is as high as 40% of the driver population are first generation immigrants. The question then is where, if you have immigration policy changing and tightening of immigration standards and compliance standards, because the source of those folks were non-registered, where is the capacity going to come from? It's not coming from, I mean, there's an aging truck driver population that continues to put a sort of governor on capacity. I just don't see the case.
Yeah.
And that's why I don't know that I agree with, I think it was Derek Leathers who talked about, thinks that the cycle is going to peak next summer. I mean, for his sake, I hope he's not right. And I don't believe it is. I think this cycle could go on longer simply because I don't know where the capacity can come from. Especially if you start to see we're going to get industrial data here shortly with Bill Stevens and the AAR data. There's been this expansion and broadening of ISM, going beyond just the first couple categories and beyond data centers. So then the consumer activity starts to pick up again. Housing comes back. Auto starts to ramp. it's you could make the case that the cycle could go a lot longer than the next year.
Yeah, I think we'll have to see what happens
Because
with
this is,
demand.
as everyone says, it's a supply-driven contraction or supply-driven tightness and not a demand one. Although the industrial sectors do look like they're showing some promise.
Yep, I agree.